Part 2, Research Findings. If there is one piece of research that you read as a result of watching this presentation, it should be Testing the Woman, Testing the Fetus by Raina Rapp. It was published in 2001, so the cfDNA screening landscape has changed dramatically since then, but her insights on why people test and what they understand are really important. Her ethnographic study explored why women choose to test and choose to opt out of testing for genetic conditions. In her research, she did acknowledge that Down syndrome accounts for only about half of all positive diagnoses from screening results, and that the rest were made of other chromosome anomalies and neural tube defects. Another thing she found problematic is informed consent. Most people have heard of Down syndrome but have very little knowledge of other conditions that the screening tools are used for. When the patient doesn't understand a diagnosis or a risk or a chance accurately, how can they really wrap their heads around what informed consent means? One of the really common examples that Rapp uses in her book is how she interviewed different women, and they were all in New York, how women viewed chromosome anomalies all being similar to Down syndrome. Now, Down syndrome has a really broad spectrum of presentation. So the one person with Down syndrome is testifying before Congress, and another person with Down syndrome has multiple comorbidities and has a very different life. When a patient doesn't understand a diagnosis, she could be looking at it as the worst case scenario instead of a best case scenario. Informed consent can really only happen when the patient is able to wrap her brain around all the possibilities and what reality might look like for her. Rapp goes on in Chapter 7 of Testing Women, Testing the Fetus to the social impact of amniocentesis in America and explores why some women refuse amniocentesis. There's a lot of trust or mistrust in the medical community, especially in different ethnic groups and different education levels. There's a lot of suspicion. Class comes into play. Racial and ethnic concerns might also need to be taken into consideration. Economics and culture both impact how amniocentesis is utilized, but the most common reason for refusal, Rapp found, was fear of miscarriage. Another mother, one who already had a child with Down syndrome, told Rapp, "What's the point of getting false assurances?" Referring to what prenatal screening doesn't find. So she felt the screening tool in 2000 could miss many other birth defects, and because of that, she thought it was not really a useful tool. Rapp has also found that many patients misunderstood the explanations given by genetic counselors. Often HMO is a barrier. In order to have a prenatal screening covered, your pregnancy must be considered high risk, at least it does today. This could delay testing past the amnio window, which just complicates things. So if you really do want a diagnosis, in Chapter 11, in Rapp's book, Endings Are Really Beginnings, one of the really important quotes that I thought was meaningful says, "No woman who entered genetic counseling exited unchanged by this encounter. All participated through acceptance or rejection of the test in the meeting between reproductive consciousness and disability consciousness, which technoscientific advances are helping to shape." Now, that was in 2001 when the landscape was very different. Today, the genetic counseling event could happen very early because the cell-free DNA testing happens at 10 weeks of gestation. So you could be working with people in a very broad range of prenatal screening and pregnancy. One of the themes that Rapp addresses is suffering, but so does Skotko et al. In Self-Perceptions of People with Down Syndrome. So in Rapp's case, She's talking about culture, preconceived notions of life and disability, severity, and that's specifically in quotation marks because what genetic counselors and medical professionals perceive as severe often includes Down syndrome, even though people who have Down syndrome are in a really broad range of presentation and impact from their extra chromosome. And perceived suffering. Another thing that comes up often related with culture. Like, I don't want to have a baby who has to suffer. I can tell you, in our family, our kids basically only suffer when I tell them that they can't have candy. Suffering is really a cultural phenomenon. So if you think that somebody is suffering because they have Down syndrome, you're likely using your own preconceived information instead of what people with Down syndrome actually say. So in Scott Coe et al., he and his research partners found that people with Down syndrome do not see themselves as people who are suffering. There are people with Down syndrome who say, I wish I didn't have Down syndrome. And that's, cool. I wish I were thinner, like not necessarily happy with all of their parts or their extra chromosome, or frustrated sometimes with communication or with discrimination, right? Those things, sure, those things also happen. However, in the research that self-advocates actually shared, their actual opinions about their own lives is that they're happy with their lives, happy with how they look, happy with their brothers and sisters, happy with, not because people are always happy when they have Down syndrome, but overwhelmingly, they were content. They weren't saying that, life is perfect, but they were saying, I have a life that I'm happy to be living. And what self-advocates say matters. They are the people living these lives. Yes, there are circles of support. And yes, there are people who are, more vulnerable than others and perhaps will be throughout the lifespan. That does not mean, though, that there is suffering involved. And it's, at least from a disability perspective, it's a pretty ableist notion to consider someone else's condition as suffering. You need to ask those individuals if they are suffering. And if they say that they're not suffering, then they're not. It's really key to believe people and not have a paternalistic attitude saying that they don't know what they feel. That's simply not fair. Now, some people test and others don't. Some people choose to go through prenatal screening, and some people just don't opt in. Today, the prenatal screening test, as you'll find in Scott Perdas's research, is really just considered to be a routine part of pregnancy, and it's a regular blood test. And so people don't even think to opt out, but some do. And some people, so the questions that RAP explores are, why screen in the first place? What's the goal? Screening is always to look for something negative. But RAP also explores why people opt out. For example, like in my case, my first 2 pregnancies, I did opt out of screening because I knew already that I would not terminate based on condition. And I didn't want that extra information while I was pregnant so that I could worry about it. What are the social implications of testing? So now that we test early at 10 weeks, more and more people are going to find it easier and easier to terminate pregnancies, because now they can do that without seeing a genetic counselor. Now they can get a screening result and say, oh, though this says 99% correct or 99% accurate, so the chances are this baby has Down syndrome, I'm going to terminate now, before I even bother with all the rest of it. Or I don't want to pay another copay, or I don't want to do all those other things. The societal implications are actually dramatic. If genetic screening companies get their way and are able to ensure that all pregnancies in the United States have the option of opting into prenatal screening, they've actually done the research on how much money they can save the government by terminating at least half of those pregnancies. And it's, as a mom of a child with Down syndrome, to me, it's gross that they're actually basing my daughter's existence on their bottom line. But they're in the market for this. This is a business. This was not created to just help people have more information, and information is power. So who benefits from all of this? Genetic screening companies. Who doesn't benefit? Society as a whole doesn't benefit, because what we lose is an important part of the fabric of our society that helps us become more empathetic, compassionate, and kind. And when we lose that and we decide that part of our population doesn't matter, that we don't see a benefit from having people with Down syndrome in our lives, that is a big problem for us long term. And so RAP also discusses informed consent. Informed consent requires education, right? So if you don't have an educational foundation in what different diagnoses entail, you are not bringing a complete informed consent to the table. You're bringing stereotypes, you're bringing perceived understanding. However, information is power, but unclear or misunderstood information becomes disempowering. You assume that because you have all this extra information that you know what you should do. The doing part is very different depending on your values, your culture, your religious background, your family, your economic situation. All of those pieces should be taken into consideration. But if you have an unclear or an incomplete understanding of the information, you're no better off than you were before. I have had the amazing opportunity to get to know Eleni Skaperdas, who is a UCLA doctoral candidate in sociology. She's currently completing an ethnographic study of prenatal screening at a Beverly Hills clinic, and I would like to talk about the results that she has found so far. So these aren't published yet. They will be soon, I hope. But they are, her research is based on Raina Rapp's Testing the Woman, Testing the Fetus. And this is part of her dissertation work. So she's really looked at the overuse of prenatal screening for low-risk pregnancies, and her ethnographic research on NIPS has shed light on the complexities of the heavily marketed and used NIPS options common since 2011. Between 2015 and 2018, she completed 53 interviews with women between the ages of 22 and 45. The mean and the median ages were both 34. Some women had their partner present for the interview, others did not. However, the questions were directed at the potential cell-free DNA screening participant. Woman was always the one receiving the questions. Some of these women chose to use NIPT, others did not. All were offered the NIPS, the screening, as part of their prenatal health care protocol. One of the areas that she has found results in is that information as power in our culture is really a prevalent idea. You have information, you have power. At some point, information actually becomes disempowering. Informed consent makes it very complex. It's very difficult to understand prenatal screening results because of the way they're marketed, quite honestly. They're clearly targeted to find trisomies. I mean, maternity 21, are you serious? It's clearly trying to avoid people like my daughter. If they didn't have T21 in it, maybe it'd be different. I mean, Harmony is another name, right? Oh, I want peace of mind. They never focus on the complexities, right? This screen can give you more information. But if you don't know what your choices would be prior to using the screening tool, they can just give you more information. That doesn't mean it's good information. It doesn't mean it's helpful information. People who have a negative screen have a false sense of security. People who have a positive screen have a rabbit hole. They don't necessarily know where they're going with it, nor do they realize the complexities of actually getting a diagnostic test run after that there's still a need for invasive testing. So the maternal fetal medicine area does not recommend prenatal screening for low-risk pregnancies. Given the misconceptions that they say, given the misconceptions regarding interpretation of cell-free DNA screening results and the serious consequences that have been documented, there are significant concerns about the consequences of broad utilization of this test in low-risk women, the vast majority of whom do not undergo genetic counseling or detailed pre-test counseling with a provider. This is really important. There is a large movement in the screening community, those who in the industry, who want to broaden this so that all women are offered this screening tool with every single pregnancy. And there is pushback from doctors, but we'll see if that's enough. So in Skaperdas's research, she asked the question, why opt in? Why use the prenatal screening tests at all? And women responded with, it's a 99% accuracy rate. It's a gender test. I can find out if I'm having a boy or a girl at 10 weeks of gestation. It gives me peace of mind, and why shouldn't we? It's pushed as unproblematic. It's just a simple blood test. So when an expectant couple receives a negative NIPT result, there's little discussion or questioning of the role of this particular screening, right? But there is a false sense of security that the test provides, and potential litigation avoided because, hey, you did the prenatal screening. We screened for what we could. There's a huge amount of money made on these tests, approximately $3,000 per test. So people like to know as many tests that can be given as possible. They don't necessarily have ideas about why they wouldn't have a screening. So what NIPS participants have learned. NIPS is less sensitive for some conditions than marketed for trisomy 21. So let's say you have you're screening for something else, it's not as sensitive, or there are more false positives. The implications of a positive screening result are much more complex than patients thought they would be. Doctors appear to misrepresent and perhaps misunderstand the role of NIPS in low-risk pregnancies. Now, this is problematic for the area of disability studies, and let's talk about how it should evolve. This is problematic for people with Down syndrome specifically, and people with other chromosomal conditions, specifically because NIPS focuses on the detection and accuracy of trisomy 21. As a result of the 99% accurate marketing message, the Down syndrome community has become the focus of NIPS. Now, the name of Sequenom's cfDNA screening tool is clearly focused on Down syndrome with the name Maternity 21. With the hyperfocus on trisomy 21, it's no surprise there has been a marked decrease in live births of individuals with Down syndrome in recent years. However, since the median life expectancy of people with Down syndrome has actually increased in recent years to 58 years, the total population of people with Down syndrome is still increasing in spite of the increased numbers of selective terminations. Now, with the increased use of NIPS in low-risk pregnancies, more and more people with Down syndrome will be targeted or discovered early in pregnancy, making it less traumatizing and probably more acceptable to use termination for selective termination purposes. Some within the disability studies community have raised concerns about negative eugenics, which is, the selective termination and basically trying to eradicate people with Down syndrome or with trisomy 18 or trisomy 13. But others are trying to balance women's rights to reproduction and control within the context of the broader disability community. Since child-rearing and family structure often disproportionately impact women, there's a huge amount of debate and discussion still needed. Over time, there will hopefully be less emphasis on overusing NIPS and a societal recognition that humans cannot control all aspects of life, even though apparently we are going to try. One pretty significant concern from a disability studies perspective is that this is really an emphasis on using the medical model above all else, and it's not really representing any form of social model. There's no recognition that these people also live full and interesting lives. At least within the Down syndrome community, the emphasis has been on suffering or severe disability, when in fact the broad range of presentation of characteristics of Down syndrome is significant. If someone has many comorbidities, you might have more impact of your condition, but people with few or no additional comorbidities people are graduating from college, they're having careers, they're getting married, they're doing all these things. And it's not that people need to do those things in order to matter, but the assumption that the medical community seems to hold is that life with Down syndrome is not a life worth living. And even in Scottco et al.'s self-perceptions of people with Down syndrome tend to be happy with their lives. They tend to love their families, tend to look at the world and make the world a better place. Those are all positives and should be appreciated as such. Culture is a factor in non-invasive prenatal screening. In Ivory's study of OBGYNs in Japan, there are a couple of important findings. No government recommendation exists in Japan to suggest amniocentesis. Prenatal diagnoses are not the cultural norm. There's a belief in healthy moms equals healthy babies, and there's a belief that since early termination is common and available, pregnancies seeking prenatal care are wanted. So this article is about NIPS in Japan and its lack of use, even in high-risk pregnancies. Culture is key to so many aspects of life, but it's even more complicated than culture. Culture plus social class, plus religious background, plus education, plus home country, plus current country, plus language. All of these factors make our differences much more complex than any of us can hope to understand in a genetic counseling session. Here's a personal example. After my daughter was born, my husband and I went to a genetic counseling session. My husband is from a Spanish-speaking background, but he was born and raised in the States. I come from a long line of proud German Catholics from a smaller city in Minnesota. He was raised by an aunt who was a Jehovah's Witness and a grandfather who was Catholic in El Salvador, even though he was born here. We met in college in a Latin American politics class. We've created a third culture for ourselves as a couple and for our children, with a little bit of the influences of each in our lives. But when we had our daughter with trisomy 21, we went to a genetic counseling appointment, I guess, to find out if future children would have Down syndrome. And to this day, I have no idea why we went. I think families like ours who have complex cultural backgrounds and a belief that they would not terminate a wanted pregnancy, in a family like ours, complex families with children with diagnoses are like a childhood game of hot potato. Medical professionals are uncomfortable, so they toss us to the next professional, assuming that the next person would provide us answers and information. So the genetic counselor that we went to was wonderful and so great, but we still didn't know the purpose of the meeting. For us, the most useful and helpful connection we found in the medical community was the medical social worker at the hospital. She got us resources and found answers to questions. She didn't pass us off to somebody else. When she didn't have an answer, she found it. This is the kind of support that helps families thrive. In Markin's study on genetic counselors and their bias, what she found was that most genetic counselors believe they are unbiased until they're not. So when Markins interviewed genetic counselors, she specifically asked about bias. And many of the counselors that she interviewed said they have to bring their personal perspective into play. And actually, I think that kind of makes sense. My problem for that is not that people bring in their personal experience, but that their personal experiences are limited. Now, that limited experience could be because of a conflict of interest. Today, we have industry-employed genetic counselors, and the impact on prenatal screening may be significant. In the article, Conflicts of Interest in Genetic Counseling, Acknowledging and Accepting, this was a really important statement. And I'm just going to read the entire quote. As an employee of the company, a genetic counselor thus has two interests: following practice guidelines and benefiting their employer. These two interests are not always in conflict, but the potential exists. And while commercial laboratories may highlight genetic counseling by a laboratory-provided genetic counselor as a value-added service benefiting all patients, it may not always be obvious to patients that they are receiving genetic counseling from an employee of a genetic testing company. Let's say the patient is meeting with a genetic counselor in order to find out if prenatal screening is appropriate. If it's a low-risk pregnancy, but the goal for the genetic counselor is to benefit his or her employer, it becomes a stickier situation. That does not mean that genetic counseling that's sponsored by a laboratory is necessarily bad, but the potential for conflict of interest exists.